हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम देखेंगे एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री क्लास 6 का चैप्टर नंबर 10 जो कि है न्यू एम्पायर्स एंड किंगडम्स। तो शुरू करते हैं आज का चैप्टर। Arvind plays a king. Arvind has been chosen to act as a king in the school play. He had expected to march solemnly in splendid robes, to twirl his moustache, and wield the silver paper wrapped sword with gusto. Imagine his surprise when he was told he would also have to sit and play a veena and recite poetry. A musician king. Who was that? He wondered. Prahastis and what they tell us. सॉरी, माइक बंद रह गया था, तो मैं फिर से शुरू से पढ़ रही हूँ. Arvind plays a king. Arvind had been chosen to act as a king in the school play. He had expected to march solemnly in splendid robes, to twirl his mustache, and wield the silver paper wrapped sword with gusto. Imagine his surprise when he was told he would also have to sit and play a veena and recite poetry. A musician king, who was that? He wondered. Prasthis and what they tell us. Arvind was supposed to be acting as Samudragupta, a famous ruler of a dynasty known as the Guptas. We know about Samudragupta from a long inscription inscribed on the Ashtokan pillar at Allahabad. It was composed as a kavya by Harisena, who was a poet and a minister at the court of Samudragupta. This inscription is of a special kind known as a prahasti, a Sanskrit word meaning in praise of. While prahastis were composed for some of the rulers you read in chapter 9, such as Gautamiputra Sri Satakarni, they became far more important from the time of the Guptas. Samudragupta's Prahastis. Let us see what Samudragupta's Prahastis tells us. The poet praised the king in glowing terms, as a warrior, as a king who won victories in battle, who was learned and the best of poets. He is also described as equal to the gods. The Prahasti was composed in very long sentences. Here is part of one such sentence. Samudragupta the warrior, whose body was most charming, being covered with the plenteous beauty of the marks of hundreds of scars caused by battle axes, arrows, spikes, spears, barbed darts, swords, iron clubs, javelins, barbed arrows, long arrows, and many other weapons. What does this description tell you about the king and also about how kings fought wars? If you look at map 7, you will notice an area shaded in green. You will also find a series of red dots along the east coast, and you will find areas marked in purple and blue as well. This map is based on the information provided in the Prahasti. Harisena describes 4 different kinds of rulers and tells us about Samudragupta's policies towards them. The rulers of Aryavata, the area shaded in green on the map. Here there were 9 rulers who were uprooted and their kingdoms were made a part of the Samudragupta's empire. The rulers of Dakshinapata, here there were 12 rulers, some of whose capitals are marked with red dots on the map. They surrendered to Samudragupta after being defeated, and he then allowed them to rule again. The inner circle of neighboring states, including Assam, coastal Bengal, Nepal, and a number of Gana Sanghas in the northwest, marked in purple on the map. They brought tribute, followed his orders, and attended his court. The rulers of the outlying areas marked in blue on the map, perhaps the descendant of the Kushanas and Sakas, and the ruler of Sri Lanka, who submitted to him and offered daughters in marriage. Find Prayaga, the old name for Allahabad, Ujjain, and Patliputra, Patna on the map. These were important centers of the Gupta rulers. What was the difference between the way in the Samudragupta treated the rulers of Aryavata and Dakshinapata? Can you suggest any reason for this difference? Genealogies. Most Prahastis also mention the ancestors of the ruler. This one mentions Samudragupta's great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and mother. His mother Kumara Devi belonged to the Lichavi Gana, while his father Chandragupta was the first ruler of the Gupta dynasty to adopt the grand title of Maharaja Adhiraj, a title that Samudragupta also used. His great-grandfather and grandfather are mentioned simply as Maharajas. It seems as if the family gradually rose to importance. Arrange these titles in orders of importance. Raja, Maharaja, Dhiraj, Maharaja. Bikram Samvat. The era beginning in the 58 BC is traditionally associated with Gupta king Chandragupta II, who had founded it as a mark of victory over the Sakas and assumed the title of Vikramaditya. Samudragupta in turn figures in the genealogies list of ancestors of the later rulers of the dynasty, such as his son Chandragupta II. We know about him from inscriptions and coins. He led an expedition to western India where he overcame the last of the Sakas. According to later belief, his court was full of learned people. About some of them you will read in chapter 11. Harshavardhana and the Harsacharitra. While we can learn about the Gupta rulers from their inscriptions and coins, we can find out about some kings from biographies. Harshavardhana, who ruled nearly 1400 years ago, was one such ruler. His court poet Banabhatta wrote his biography, the Harsacharitra, in Sanskrit. This gives us the genealogy of Harsha and ends with his becoming king. Xuanzang, about whom you read in chapter 9, also spent a lot of time at Harsha's court and left a detailed account of what he saw. Harsha was not the eldest son of his father, but became king of Thansel after both his father and elder brother died. His brother-in-law was the ruler of Kannauj and he was killed by the ruler of Bengal. Harsha took over the kingdom of Kannauj and then led an army against the ruler of Bengal. Although he was successful in the east and conquered Magadha and probably Bengal also, he was not successful elsewhere. He tried to cross the Narmada to march into the Deccan but was stopped by a ruler belonging to the Chalukya dynasty, Pulakesin II. Look at the political map of India and list the present-day states which Harshavardhana passed through when he went to Bengal and up to the Narmada. The Pallavas, Chalukyas and Pulakesins Parhastis. The Pallavas and Chalukyas were the most important ruling dynasty in South India during this period. The kingdom of the Pallavas spread from the region around their capital Kanchipuram to the Kaveri Delta, while that of the Chalukya was centered around the Raichur Doab between the rivers Krishna and Tungabhadra. Aihole, the capital of Chalukyas, was an important trading center. It developed as a religious center with a number of temples. The Pallavas and Chalukyas frequently raided one another's land, especially attacking the capital cities, which were prosperous towns. The best known Chalukya ruler was Pulakesen II. We know about him from a Prahasti composed by his court poet Ravi Kirti. This tells us about his ancestors who are traced back through 4 generations from father to son. Pulakesen evidently got the kingdom from his uncle. According to Ravi Kirti, he led expedition along both west and the east coast. Besides, he checked the advance of Harsha. There is an interesting play of words in the poem. Harsha means happiness. The poet says that after this defeat, Harsha was no longer Harsha. Pulakesen also attacked the Pallava king who took shelter behind the walls of Kanchipuram. But the Chalukya victory was short-lived. Ultimately, both the Pallavas and the Chalukyas gave way to new rulers belonging to the Rashtrakuta and Chola dynasties, about which you will study in class 7. Who were the other rulers who tried to control the coast and why? How were these kingdoms administered? As in the case of earlier kings, land revenue remained important for these rulers, and the village remained the basic unit of administration. There were some new developments as well. Kings adopted a number of steps to win the support of men who were powerful, either economically or socially, or because of their political and military strength. For instance, some important administrative posts were now hereditary. This means that sons succeeded fathers to these posts. For example, the poet Harisena was a Mahadandanayaka or chief judicial officer like his father. Sometimes one person held many offices. For instance, beside being a Mahadandanayaka, Harisena was a Kumar Amtya, meaning an important minister, and a Sandhi Vigrahika, meaning a minister of war and peace. Besides, important men probably had a say in local administration. This included the Nagara Sreshti or chief banker or merchant of the city, the Satavaha or leader of the merchant caravans, the Prathama Kulika or the chief craftsman, and the head of the Kayasthas or scribes. These policies were reasonably effective, but sooner or later some of these powerful men grew strong enough to set up independent kingdoms. What do you think may have been the advantage and disadvantage of having hereditary officers? A new kind of army. Like earlier rulers, some of these kings maintained a well organized army with elephants, chariots, cavalry, and foot soldiers. Besides, there were military leaders who provided the king with troops whenever he needed them. They were not paid regular salaries. Instead, some of them received grants of land. They collected revenue from the land and used this to maintain soldiers and horses and provide equipment for warfare. These men were known as Samanthas. Whenever the ruler was weak, Samanthas tried to become independent. Assemblies in the southern kingdoms. The inscriptions of the Pallavas mention a number of local assemblies. These included the Sabha, which was an assembly of Brahmin land owners. This assembly functioned through sub-committees which looked after irrigation, agricultural operations, making roads, local temples, etc. The Ur was a village assembly found in areas where the landowners were not Brahmins, and the Nagaram was an organization of merchants. It is likely that these assemblies were controlled by rich and powerful landowners and merchants. Many of these local assemblies continued to function for centuries. Ordinary people in the kingdoms. We can catch an occasional glimpse of the lives of ordinary people from plays and other accounts. Let us look at some of these. Kalidasa is known for his plays depicting life in King's Court. An interesting feature about this place is that the king and most Brahmins are shown as speaking Sanskrit, while women and men other than the king and Brahmins use Prakrit. His most famous play, Abhijanana Sakuntalam, is the story of the love between a king named Dushyanta and a young woman named Sakuntala. We find an interesting description of the plight of a poor fisherman in this play. A fisherman finds a ring. A fisherman found a precious ring which the king had given to Sakuntala but which had been accidentally swallowed by a fish. When he went to the palace with it, the gateman accused him of theft, and the chief police officer was rather rude. However, the king was happy when he saw the ring and sent a reward for the fisherman. Then the police officer and gateman decided to take a share of the reward and went along with the fisherman to have a drink. Do you think that if a poor man finds something and reports this to the police, he would be treated like this today? Name a famous man who taught in Prakrit and a king who issued inscription in Prakrit. The Chinese pilgrim Faxian noticed the plight of those who were treated as untouchables by the high and mighty. They were expected to live on the outskirts of the city. He writes, if such a man enters a town or a marketplace, he strikes a piece of wood in order to keep himself separate. People hearing this sound know what it means and avoid touching him or brushing against him. And Banavata provides us with a vivid picture of King's army on the move. The king's army. The king traveled with an enormous amount of equipment. Apart from weapons, there were things of daily use such as pots, pans, furniture, golden footstools, food, including animals such as goat, deer, rabbits, vegetables, spices, carried on cars or loaded on pack animals such as camels and elephants. This huge army was accompanied by musicians beating drums and others playing horns and trumpets. Villagers had to provide hospitality along the way. They came with gifts of curds, gold, and flowers, and provided fodder for the animals. They also tried to meet the king and place their complaints and petitions before him. The army left a trail of destruction behind. Elephants often trampled down the herds of villagers, and the oxen yoked to the caravans of merchants ran away, scared by the tumult. As Banavata says, the whole world was swallowed up in dust. Make a list of all the things that were carried with the army. What did the villagers bring for the king? Elsewhere, find Arabia on map 6. Although it is a desert, it was at the hub of communication for centuries. In fact, Arab merchants and sailors played an important role in the sea trade between India and Europe. Others who lived in Arabia were the Bedouins, pastoral tribes depending mainly on camels, hardy animals that could survive in the desert. Around 1400 years ago, Prophet Muhammad introduced a new religion, Islam, in Arabia. Like Christianity, Islam was a religion that laid stress on the equality and unity of all before Allah, the one supreme God. Here is a verse from the Quran, the sacred book of Islam. For Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for true men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in Allah's remembrance. For them has Allah prepared forgiveness and great reward. Within 100 years, Islam spread to North Africa, Spain, Iran, and India. Arab settlers who were already familiar with the coastal settlements of the subcontinent now brought the new religion with them. Arab soldiers conquered Sindh in present-day Pakistan about 1300 years ago. Trace the route that would have been taken by the sailors and soldiers on map 6. तो ये चैप्टर ख़त्म हुआ और ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज. तो अभी हम शुरू करेंगे चैप्टर 11 बिल्डिंग्स पेंटिंग्स एंड बुक. Marthasamy and the Iron Pillar. Marthasamy was so excited. His brother had propelled his wheelchair all along the dusty stony path past the towering Qutub Minar and up the metal ramp. It had been tough, but now he was here in front of the famous Iron Pillar. It was an unforgettable experience. The Iron Pillar. The Iron Pillar at Mehruli, Delhi is a remarkable example of the skill of Indian craftsperson. It is made of iron 7.2 meter high and weighs over 3 tons. It was made about 1500 years ago. We know the date because there is an inscription on the pillar mentioning a ruler named Chandra, who probably belonged to the Gupta dynasty. What is amazing is the fact that the pillar has not rusted in all these years. Metallurgy. Ancient Indian metallurgists made major contribution to the metallurgical history of the world. Archaeological excavations have shown that the Harappans were master craftsmen and had knowledge of copper metallurgy. They even manufactured bronze by mixing copper and tin. While the Harappans belong to the Bronze Age, their successors belong to the Iron Age. India produced highly advanced types of iron, forged iron, wrought iron, and cast iron. Buildings in brick and stone. The skills of our craftsperson are also apparent in the buildings that have survived, such as stupas. The word stupa means a mound. While there are several kinds of stupas, round and tall, big and small, these have certain common features. Generally, there is a small box placed at the center or heart of the stupa. This may contain bodily remains such as teeth, bone, or ashes of the Buddha or his followers, or things they used, as well as precious stones and coins. This box, known as a relic casket, was covered with earth. Later, a layer of mud brick or baked brick was added on top, and then the dome like structure was sometimes covered with carved stone slabs. Often, a path known as the Pradakshina path was laid around the stupa. This was surrounded with railings. Entrance to the path was through gateways. Devotees walked around the stupa in a clockwise direction as a mark of devotion. Both railings and gateways were often decorated with sculpture. Find Amravati on map 7. This was a place where a magnificent stupa once existed. Many of the stone carvings for decorating the stupa were made about 2000 years ago. Other buildings were hollowed out of rock to make artificial caves. Some of these were very elaborately decorated with sculptures and painted walls. Some of the earliest Hindu temples were also built at this time. Deities such as Vishnu, Shiva, and Durga were worshipped in these shrines. The most important part of the temple was the room known as the Garbhagriha, where the image of the chief deity was placed. It was here that priests performed religious rituals and devotees offered worship to the deity. Often as the at Often as at Bhitargaon, a tower known as the Sikhara was built on the top of the Garbhagriha to mark this out as a sacred place. Building Sikharas required careful planning. Most temples also had a space known as the Mandapa. It was a hall where people could assemble. Find Mahabalipuram and Aihole on map 7. Some of the finest stone temples were built in these towns. Some of these are shown here. How were stupas and temples built? There were several stages in building a stupa or a temple. Usually, kings or queens decided to build this as it was an expensive affair. First, good quality stone had to be found, quarried, and transported to the place that was often carefully chosen for the new building. Here, these rough blocks of stones had to be shaped and carved into pillars and panels for walls, floors, and ceilings, and then these had to be placed in precisely the right position. Kings and queens probably spent money from their treasury to pay the craftsperson who worked to build these splendid structures. Besides, when devotees came to visit the temple or the stupa, they often brought gifts which were used to decorate the buildings. For example, an association of ivory workers paid for one of the beautiful gateways as Sanchi. Among the others who paid for decorations were merchants, farmers, garland makers, perfumers, maids, and hundreds of men and women who are known only by their names, which were inscribed on pillars, railings, and walls. So, when you get a chance to visit any of these buildings, remember how several hundreds of people probably worked to construct and decorate them. Make a diagram like the one on page 88 to show the stages in the building of a temple or stupa. Painting. Find Ajanta on map 7. This is a place where several caves were hollowed out of the hills over centuries. Most of these were monasteries for Buddhist monks, and some of them were decorated with paintings. Here are some examples as the caves are dark inside. Most of these paintings were done in the light of torches. The colors, which are vivid even after 1500 years, were made of plants and minerals. The artists who created these splendid works of art remain unknown. The world of books. Some of the best known epics were written during this period. Epics are grand, long compositions about heroic men and women and include stories about gods. A famous Tamil epic, the Silapadikaram, was composed by a poet named Ilango around 1800 years ago. It is the story of a merchant named Kovlan who lived in Puhar and fell in love with a courtesan named Madhavi, neglecting his wife Kanangi. Later, he and Kanangi left Puhar and went to Madurai, where he was wrongly accused of theft by the court jeweler of the Pandya king. The king sentenced Kovlan to death. Kanangi, who still loved him, was full of grief and anger at this injustice and destroyed the entire city of Madurai. A description from the Silapadikaram. Here is how the poet describes Kanangi's grief. O witness of my grief, you cannot console me. Is it right that your body, fairer than pure gold, lies unwashed here in the dust? Is it just that in the red glow of the twilight, your handsome chest, framed with a flower wreath, lies thrown down on the bare earth, while I remain alone, helpless, and abandoned to despair? Is there no God? Is there no God in this country? Can there be a God in a land where the sword of the king is used for the murder of innocent strangers? Is there no God? No God. Another Tamil epic, the Manimekalai, was composed by Satnar around 1400 years ago. This describes the story of the daughter of Kovlan and Madhavi. This beautiful composition were lost to scholars for many centuries, till their manuscripts were rediscovered about 100 years ago. Other writers such as Kalidasa, about whom you read in chapter 10, wrote in Sanskrit. A verse from the Meghadutta. Here is a verse from Kalidasa's best known poem, the Meghadutta, in which a monsoon cloud is imagined to be a messenger between lovers who are separated from one another. See how the poet describes the breeze that will carry the cloud northwards. A cool breeze, delightful as it is touched with the fragrance of the earth, swollen by your showers, inhaled deeply by elephants, and causing the wild figs to ripen, will blow gently as you go. Do you think Kalidasa can be described as a lover of nature? Recording and preserving old stories. A number of Hindu religious stories that were in circulation earlier were written down around the same time. These include the Puranas. Purana literally means old. The Puranas contain stories about gods and goddesses such as Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, or Parvati. They also contain details on how they were to be worshipped. Besides, there are accounts about the creation of the world and about kings. The Puranas were written in simple Sanskrit verse and were meant to be heard by everybody, including women and Sudras who were not allowed to study the Vedas. They were probably recited in temples by priests, and people came to listen to them. Two Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, had been popular for a very long time. Some of you may be familiar with these stories. The Mahabharata is about a war fought between the Kauravas and Pandavas, who were cousins. This was a war to gain control of the throne of the Kurus and their capital, Hastinapura. The story itself was an old one, but was written down in the form in which we know it today, about 1500 years ago. Both the Puranas and the Mahabharata are supposed to have been compiled by Vyasa. The Bhagavad Gita, about which you learned in chapter 9, was also included in the Mahabharata. The Ramayana is about Rama, a prince of Kosala who was sent into exile. His wife Sita was abducted by the king of Lanka named Ravana. The Rama had to fight a battle to get her back. He won and returned to Ayodhya, the capital of Kosala, after his victory. Like the Mahabharata, this was an old story that was now written down. Valmiki is recognized as the author of the Sanskrit Ramayana. There are several versions, many of which are performed, of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, popular amongst people in different parts of the subcontinent. Find out about a person in your state. Stories told by ordinary people. Ordinary people also told stories, composed poems and songs, sang, danced, and performed plays. Some of these are preserved in collections of stories such as the Jatakas and the Panchatantra, which were written down around this time. Stories from the Jatakas were often shown on the railings of stupas and in paintings in places such as Ajanta. Here is one such story. The story of the Monkey King. Once upon a time there was a great monkey king who lived on the banks of the Ganga in the Himalayas with 80,000 followers. They fed on the fruit of a special mango tree which were very sweet. Such exquisite mangoes did not grow on the plains. One day a ripe mango fell into the river and floated all the way to Varanasi. There the king of the city who was bathing in the river found it and was amazed when he tasted it. He asked the foresters of his kingdom whether they could find the tree for him, and they led him all the way to the Himalayas. There the king and his courtiers had their fill of mangoes. At night, the king discovered that the monkeys were also feasting on the fruit and decided to kill them. However, the king of the monkeys worked out a plan to save his followers. He broke off branches of the mango trees and tied them to form a bridge across the river and held on to one end till all his followers crossed over. Exhausted with effort, he fell down and lay dying. The human king saw what had happened and tried unsuccessfully to revive the monkey. When he died, the king mourned his death and paid him full respect. This story is shown on a piece of sculpture found from a stupa at Bharuch in central India. Can you identify which parts of the story are shown in the sculpture? Why do you think these were chosen? Writing books on science. This was also the time when Aryabhatta, a mathematician and astronomer, wrote a book in Sanskrit known as the Aryabhattiyam. He stated the day and night were caused by the rotation of the earth on its axis, even though it seems as if the sun is rising and setting every day. He developed a scientific explanation for eclipses as well. He also found a way of calculating the circumference of a circle, which is nearly as accurate as the formula we use today. Bharamira, Brahmagupta, and Bhaskaracharya were some other mathematicians and astronomers who made several discoveries. Try and find out more about them. 0. While numerals had been used earlier, mathematicians in India now invented a special symbol for 0. This system of counting was adopted by the Arabs and then spread to Europe. It continues to be in use throughout the world. The Romans used a system of counting without using 0. Try and find out more about it. Ayurveda. Ayurveda is a well-known system of health science that was developed in ancient India. The two famous practitioners of Ayurveda in ancient India were Charaka, 1st 2nd century CE, and Susruta, 4th century CE. Charaka Samhita, written by Charaka, is a remarkable book on medicine. In his treatise Susruta Samhita, Susruta speaks about elaborate surgical procedures. Elsewhere, paper has become part of our daily lives. The books we read are printed on paper and we use paper for writing. Paper was invented in China about 1900 years ago by a man named Kai Lun. He beat plant fibers, cloth, rope, and the bark of trees, soaked these in water, and then pressed, drained, and dried the pulp to create paper. Even today, handmade paper is made through a similar process. The technique of making paper was a closely guarded secret for centuries. It reached Korea about 1400 years ago and spread to Japan soon after. It was known in Baghdad about 1800 years ago. From Baghdad it spread to Europe, Africa and other parts of Asia including the subcontinent. What were manuscripts in early India made out of? तो इसी के साथ हमारा ये चैप्टर भी कंप्लीट होता है और ये चैप्टर ये है एक्सरसाइज और साथ ही में हमारा ये बुक भी कंप्लीट हो गया। तो आज हमारा एनसीईआरटी क्लास 6 का बुक कंप्लीट हो गया है। अगर आपको ऐसे डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन करना है तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए और वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए। तो आज का सेशन यहीं तक था। Thank you. Thanks for joining.